Now, I've noted the connection between chapter 16 and chapter 21, the other part of the story of Hagar and Ishmael. But I also want to note a connection made by scholars to the plight of the children of Israel. A number of scholars point out that Sarah's mistreatment of Hagar is the same word that is used of the Egyptians' mistreatment of the children of Israel in the book of Exodus. So there's this really interesting correlation between the person of Hagar and the children of Israel, Abram's descendants. Hagar's story is Israel's story. She's enslaved, she's abused, she flees into the wilderness, she encounters God there, and she receives a promise of becoming a great nation. And as we look at the teachings of our church, Swedenborg notes a similar correlation. He says this: the spiritual church is represented by Hagar and by Ishmael. So there's an interesting spiritual connection too between the stories. As we look at this story, in a literal sense, really Sarai is the villain of this piece. She has the idea of giving her handmaiden to Abram because she feels she's not able to bear a child despite the promise that's been given to her. She doesn't like the result that she gets. And so she complains to Abram. But then Abram's not that much better either, because he says, well, there you go, she's your servant, do with her as you wish. It's a difficult situation for Hagar to be put in, literally speaking. But of course, as we look at the word, we look at these stories and we say, well, there's a meaning here. There's something spiritual to be learnt. There is within this a very human story. And if we're able to unpack the internal meaning of it, we're able to access something of our own journey through life. Our storytelling often reflects the human condition in interesting ways. Pam and I saw a film last night called Rental Family. And just interesting to watch the way that a fairly simple story on an external level reflected so many interesting aspects to the human story we all travel. And we see it in the Word, we see it in dreams as well. We often find hidden truths that we're unconscious of. We often find truths that we're actually not prepared ourselves to acknowledge. So we talk about the story of the patriarchs as being the development of the human mind, our own journey as we travel through life. And last month when we talked about Genesis chapter 12, I wonder if you remember what we said Sarai represented. She represented spiritual wisdom. Now here, I would say she represents much the same. Hagar, being the servant girl and being an Egyptian, represents a type of wisdom, but on a much more superficial, external level. And we talk about science, we talk about facts, we talk about logic. These are the sorts of things that Hagar represents. In verse 4 it says, so he, Abram, went into Hagar and she conceived. And when she saw that she'd conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes. And this is the beginning of the trouble. And if we compare spiritual wisdom and natural wisdom, we often see spiritual wisdom as being barren, unproductive, unuseful kind of stuff. But then, of course, the story leads on to the birth of two boys. Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, and a few years later, Sarai gives birth to Isaac. And we read in chapter 16 this description of Ishmael. If you remember what it was, he shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. So Swedenborg talks about these two boys as representing a new level of life, the rational level of life. And as you imagine children growing up, we learn our facts, we learn the things that we're told in school. But as we reach our early teens, we develop this rational mind for ourselves. We start to process the world for ourselves. All that we've learnt, all that we see around us, we begin to put it together in our own way. And so We've all had the experience of the rebellious nature of a teenager. They think they know everything. And it can be very difficult for parents to deal with them. And that's Ishmael. That's the early rational mind. That's the wild man whose hand is against every man. The thing about that is it's often, unknowingly, very self-focused. Like, has no sense at all that it can do anything wrong. All the wrong is out there in the world. And it takes quite some years for us to see that. As we understand our development, we develop from within to without. It's stimulated by the Lord's life flowing in. But we don't see it that way. We see a foundation of facts upon which we build our rational mind, and we build and we build and we develop that way. If you imagine pouring water into a glass, where does the water come from? The water comes from the top down, doesn't it? But how does the glass fill? It fills from the bottom up. And I think this mirrors the process of our development. We get the sense of growing from the bottom up, but it's the Lord's life flowing into us that brings that about. The thing is that natural wisdom, that Ishmael mind, the Hagar mind, that early awareness, can't grasp spiritual understanding and spiritual wisdom at all. It has no idea about it, doesn't understand what it is, doesn't understand its relevance, cannot see how it can be productive at all. And this is this tension between Sarai and Hagar. So Hagar cannot see how Sarai can be productive. But it's a necessary part of our development and growth. We have to go through this process. So a couple of other things I just want to draw your attention to. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her. So this is Hagar running away into the desert, the wilderness, to get away from Sarai, and it says that the angel of the Lord found her. And to me, that speaks of the parable of the Good Shepherd, of the Lord going and finding the one sheep in the wilderness. It speaks to me of the Lord's accommodation of our states. He speaks to us in ways we can understand and carries us forward because of that. And then when Hagar names God and says, "You are the God who sees," the interesting thing about that word, sees, is the link to the idea of appearances. The same word is used to describe a handsome appearance in the first book of Samuel, chapter 16. And of course, that's where Hagar is. She's in the world of appearances, in facts and logic of the natural world. Nevertheless, there is a divine provision for Hagar, and there's a divine provision for us in that state. None of us begin our life spiritually evolved. We begin in a natural, often self-centered, self-focused way. So what do we learn from the story? How can we apply this idea? Think of those two kinds of rational minds, the argumentative teenager mind and the more mature, spiritually evolved mind. One of the things that I think about is the way we deal with one another and we deal with the circumstances in which we find ourselves. I wonder if you can notice what your natural tendency is when you meet a person or a situation that you don't like. What happens? We often start to explain it in our mind. Is our explanation usually good to start with, or is it usually a negative interpretation of what's going on? I would vouch that for most of us, it's true of me too, we begin in the negative. We begin by explaining someone's actions towards us as hostile. They meant to do it. They're trying to punish us. That's where we start. That's the Ishmael mind. The spiritual principle, however, reverses it entirely. One of the teachings that I love in our church is the idea that those who live in charity explain others' actions by attributing good motives to them. Now that's a lot harder to do, but that's the spiritual principle that we need to put into practice to engage that spiritual, rational mind. Now, the external rational says, oh, that'll get you nowhere. You're just going to be a doormat. They're going to run all over you and get what they want. But if you actually engage it, if you actually practice those principles, it's interesting to see how that can actually turn the situation around. Now, we might also talk about many other things. We might talk about humility. We might talk about having a balanced perspective. We might talk about empathy or kindness, responding with love rather than reacting. Those are all spiritual principles that we can apply when we tend to do the exact opposite. And that's the story that we're talking about today. The last thing I'll say is, we need to remember that this is all part of the process. It would be lovely to be born perfect straight away. It would be lovely to be born in such a way that we can instantly know what the good is, to do it without having to think too hard, but we're not. We're imperfect beings. We have a process to go through. And this story represents that process. It is a struggle. It is difficult at times. We need to challenge and correct ourselves. This is the life we have. What I want you to remember is the God who sees me. That in all our states, in all our imperfections, in all our failings, in all the things that we get wrong, God sees me and leads me somewhere better. And if we can notice that, we're able to move on, live our lives in a better way, become better, kinder people, and influence others for the good.